Hi everyone, my name is Adam Benjamin. I'm a first year doctoral student at Binghamton University. My talk is related to the Green Revolution in the 20th century and US hegemony. So the rise of US hegemony in the mid 20th century would have been unthinkable without the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution is typically described as a package of new agricultural innovations, including motor mechanization, petrochemicals such as synthetic fertilizer, and hybrid seeds, all of which started to emerge in the 1930s. This is an important part of the story, however, it's not the full story. Rather, these new technologies were paired with imperialist logics of domination to produce a US-led material expansion. Between 1945 and 1973, the US Hegemonic Compact, which included the US state, philanthropic foundations, financial institutions such as USAID, the IMF, World Bank, and agribusiness, all engaged in a joint effort to remold the capitalist world system in its image. So before I discuss the Green Revolution and the rise of US hegemony, we must first begin with a period of conquest that made it all possible. So territorial expansion in the 18th and 19th centuries would set the stage for the Green Revolution to emerge. Through the application of private property, technologies of transport, including railroads and steam engine, and military conquest, the US enclosed and appropriated human and extra-human natures for capital. As Origi quips, the whole internal history of the United States imperialism was one vast process of territorial seizure and expansion. This was rationalized by the Promethean drive to subdue the quote-unquote wilderness and the quote-unquote savage and uncivilized inhabitants. The geographic expansion was aided by the extension of the railroad system. By 1890, over 150 miles of track weaved across the country, accelerating the transformation of indigenous land into farmsteads that were then dedicated to cattle ranching and wheat monocultures. The rail, which was financed by British capital and the US government, permitted the open flow of agricultural products to strategic zones of production. Miles of steel tentacles would wrap around the North American continent and entangle new zones within a web of capitalist power. The railroad system also facilitated the near annihilation of indigenous people and extra-human life, such as buffalo, whose numbers reached close to extinction by the end of the 19th century. Buffalo were replaced by cattle, whose numbers grew exponentially by 10 million by 1890. This illustrates the genocidal and ecocidal tendency of US imperialism, as native flora and fauna were destroyed and substituted with foreign species. So once the United States informal empire had been secured, the 20th century agricultural revolution, dubbed the Green Revolution, could take form. The scientific innovations of the Green Revolution, as mentioned, included new machinery such as improvements in tractors, plows, and drills, petrochemicals such as synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, and the development of high-yielding hybrid seeds. The reliance on seeds, petrochemicals, and mechanization drove down the average labor time of producing agricultural commodities. The farming process became highly capitalized and industrialized over this period, as non-purchase inputs shrank in half, while purchased inputs doubled. The dramatic shift towards a capitalist-intensive and industrialized agriculture in the US undermined small producers. Between 1935 and 1970, the number of farms in the United States shrank by 56%. Small producers who operated on a family farm model were outcompeted and subsumed by big agribusiness. By 1969, just 7.3% of farmers produced over 50% of all agricultural products. Therefore, the Green Revolution acted as a lever of primitive accumulation, although indirectly, by driving smallholders from their land and thrusting them into a reserve army of labor in urban centers. Echoing the Cartesian movement of the 17th century, the Green Revolution called for the application of science to dominate, manage, and appropriate nature. Although science is typically branded as politically neutral, Wallerstein reminds us that, quote, modern science and historical capitalism have always been in close alliance. For James Scott, the capitalist process of Taylorism and scientific agriculture are not just strategies of production, but also strategies of control and appropriation of nature. Agricultural innovation was paired with imperialist logics of domination to produce record ecological surpluses. Between 1940 and 1970, previously modest grains and corn production skyrocketed from 30 yields per acre to over 80 yields per acre. In the same period, wheat production doubled. These ecological surpluses produced by the Green Revolution would fuel, in a Origi sense of the term, a material expansion, which is the first phase of the US cycle of accumulation. Following the Long World War, which is best understood as an inter-imperialist rivalry, the US assumed the throne as a world hegemon. Hegemony refers to a situation in which one state not only dominates, but also leads the capitalist world system. As Riggi states, quote, world hegemony is not just dominance. It is power associated with dominance, expanded by the exercise of intellectual and moral leadership. This notion of hegemony in this Gramscian sense is, in the words of Raj Patel, a cocktail of coercion and consent. At the core of the US hegemonic order was the Green Revolution, which served as a model of freedom and of development for the rest of the world to follow. In the post-war period, the Green Revolution model spread across the globe, taking the form of, quote, international aid. For instance, in 1947, Marshall Aid was designed to help some European nations reconstruct following the aftermath of World War II, supplying recipient nations with US food, feed, and fertilizers. This was expanded under Public Law 480 of 1954, where the US penetrated new markets in the Global South through agri-food commodity relations. In effect, these markets became a, quote, dumping ground for US exports. According to Harriet Friedman, dumping refers to the sale of a commodity abroad at a price lower than the domestic market. The US food regime, coined by Friedman and Phil McMichael, was successful in governing world food relations in favor of US power and accumulation. It discouraged domestic food production in recipient nations while simultaneously hooking them on US exports. In the 1950s and 60s, US wheat exports jumped from 33% to 50%. At the same time, wheat imports from nations in the Global South increased 3.5 times. In effect, this transformed formerly self-sufficient nations into import-dependent recipients of US grains. Paired with food subsidies was the exportation of Green Revolution quote-unquote know-how, which included the high-yielding seeds, mechanization, petrochemicals, and techniques in land management, which took the form of the monoculture. The Rockefeller and Ford Foundations duplicated the Green Revolution model, creating agricultural programs and, by the 60s, international agricultural institutes in Mexico, India, Nigeria, the Philippines, and on and on. The first agricultural program in Mexico was in 1943. The Mexican Agricultural Program, or MAP, was spearheaded by the Rockefeller Foundation, which sought to transform Mexican agriculture into an input-intensive, market-oriented mode of production. In 1940, the US Vice President Henry Wallace, upon his return from Mexico, declared, quote, the Rockefeller Foundation is a proper vehicle for transferring an American style of agriculture to Mexico. One of MAP's lead scientists, George Harrar, also understood that the program was more about technologies. It was also about imposing a capitalist mode of production on the countryside. He said, quote, agriculture is a business. It is an industry, and treated as such, it responds beautifully. MAP was indeed a concerted effort among the US government, the Rockefeller Foundation, and agribusiness to commercialize Mexican agriculture and divorce peasants from their land. This state philanthropic agribusiness compact favored large-scale commercial planters over that of smallholders. Green Revolution technologies were unevenly concentrated in the hands of an agrarian bourgeois class. Peasants were pushed to the margins, denied equal access to Green Revolution technologies, and could not compete with this input-intensive model of their competitors. To survive, they were forced to enter urban centers as rightless and landless proletarians. In fact, between 1943 and 1968, Mexico's agricultural labor force had shrunk by 50%. This reserve army of labor was absorbed within Mexico's growing industrial centers, where they were fed by cheap Green Revolution grains. By 1954, MAP's leading scientist in wheat breeding, Norman Borlaug, developed a new high-yielding wheat variety dubbed Miracle Wheat. It was the application of new technologies, but we also must remember it was paired with the imperial drive to conquer and appropriate nature that fueled a fourfold increase in Mexico's agricultural productivity in wheat. The Green Revolution was celebrated as a technocratic solution to combating neo-Malthusian fears of overpopulation, hunger, and the perceived threat of communism. Beginning in the 1950s, through Green Revolution, US imperialism and neo-Malthusianism was intimately connected. This was rooted from the Malthus Decree in 1789 that, quote, the misery of lower classes is a result of natural law. His population resource theory argued that hunger and poverty were a result of population growth outstripping resource supplies. Historically, neo-Malthusian doctrines have been invoked by the ruling class always to naturalize hunger, poverty, and exploitation in short mass misery, especially during times of great class struggle. In the 1950s, neo-Malthusianism was revived by the US hegemonic bloc to fortify power and profit accumulation during the heyday of the Cold War. The architect of the US hegemonic order was President Truman. His point four address in 1949 outlined the ideological blueprint for conquering and managing the rest of nature, all under the guise of, quote, international aid. In his inaugural address in 1949, he redefined more than half the people of the world as, quote, undeveloped, as, quote, victims of disease, with their economic systems, quote, primitive and stagnant. Herein lies the U.S. civilizing project. Through the imperial gaze of the U.S. hegemon, the, quote, undeveloped world was not yet civilized, yet they could be through the paternal guidance of the U.S. 2 years after Truman's address, Warren Weaver, the director of MAP, manufactured the World Food Problem Report in 1951. It stated that, quote, the problem of food has become one of the world's most acute and pressing problems, the cause of the world's present tension and unrest. Agitators from communist countries are making the most of the situation. This report landed on the table surrounded by Rockefeller trustees in June of 1951. One trustee, Carl T. Compton, said, I suspect, quote, I suspect that India may be fertile ground for the activity in this field. The overpopulation, the low living standards, and the threat of communism are, of course, well known. This greenlighted the Rockefeller Foundation, now aligned with the Ford Foundation, to institute the Indian Agricultural Program in 1954. In an attempt to separate themselves from British hegemony and its legacy of world empire, President Truman vowed in his address that, quote, the old imperialism, the old exploitation for profit has no place in our plans. Ironically, throughout the post-war period, the U.S. hegemonic compact would engage in projects that were imperial in every sense except for the word. In 1952, the Ford Foundation created Resources for the Future, which was a conservation organization that characteristically approached natural resource problems from the viewpoints of economics. Between 1953 and 1977, the Ford Foundation supplied RFF with $48 million to identify, survey, and extract raw materials from the peripheral zones of the world system. RFF links arms with the U.S. Materials Policy Commission under the command of William S. Paley. The Paley Commission released a report in 1953 entitled Resources for Freedom, which granted the U.S. government, quote, the inalienable right to extract cheap raw materials from underdeveloped countries. At the same time, the Technical Cooperation Administration, following the tenets of the Truman Doctrine, initiated extraction projects in Latin America, including Peru, Brazil, and Bolivia, to appropriate lead, zinc, tin, and other raw materials. Just as the TCA was bleeding Latin American mineral deposits dry, so too was it appropriating agricultural products, including cinchona bark, vegetable oils, and rubber, all to fuel the engines of production in the core. This state capital conservation compact seized control of global production and distribution of raw materials. All of this was rebranded as a strategy of, quote, national security during the heyday of the Cold War. Wherever the U.S. met resistance to its hegemonic project, it resorted to the most violent forms of repression. The U.S. deployed a tonic of science, capital, and brute force to, quote, pacify unruly rural classes in the countryside. The U.S. and other core powers were threatened by a revolutionary wave of social movements, especially in parts of Asia and Latin America. At stake was not just a perceived slide towards communism, but also the potential disruption of agribusiness operations. Any movement that did not align with the Green Revolution model, particularly in relation to private property, was a threat to the U.S. hegemonic order. Therefore, materially and ideologically, the Green Revolution and U.S. hegemony form two sides of the same coin. American resistance to land reform is best exemplified in the U.S.-backed coups, such as in Guatemala in 1954 and in Iran in 1953, as well as U.S.-supported military dictators such as Suharto in Indonesia in 1965 and in Chile in 1973. It is, to borrow from Jim Petra's, a, quote, open secret that the U.S. would destabilize democratically elected governments to protect its economic and geopolitical interests. So that was a lot. So the upshot, just the point of all of this is, one, the techniques of the Green Revolution, which combined agricultural innovation with this Promethean drive to dominate nature, produced a huge crescendo in ecological surpluses, food, raw materials, energy on American soil. Through food aid initiatives, agricultural programs, and when resistance emerged, acts of brute force, the U.S. diffused the Green Revolution model across the globe. Paradoxically, global hunger increased during the post-war period, especially in the rural arena, despite the fact that despite a surge in food surpluses and the fall of food commodity prices. That's because the Green Revolution was never intended to address hunger. Rather, it was a tool wielded by the US hegemonic bloc to enforce unequal property relations, squash peasant movements, and transform post-colonial nations into frontiers where raw materials, energy, food, and cheap labor could be extracted, all in service of endless capital accumulation. However, just as the Green Revolution underwrote the US-led material expansion in the post-war period, so too is the Green Revolution's exhaustion underwriting the US-led financial expansion and the erosion of the US hegemonic order. Obviously, this is an unfortunate oversimplification, yet due to time constraints and perhaps an overly ambitious and broad topic, I can't go further, but ideally in a future event, I will get to tell a second or perhaps even third story of the long Green Revolution and the cycle of US hegemony. Thank you.